11 family members, a massacre on Easter Sunday, and a chilling 911 call that no one saw coming. I need the police. I'll just kill my family. For years, Martin Caldwell had been nothing but a shadow in his own home. Unnoticed, unwanted, a failure in his mother's eyes. But on April 6, 1975, everything changed. The resentment, the humiliation, the years of bottled-up hatred, all of it exploded in just 5 minutes. But the most terrifying part? He didn't feel a single ounce of remorse. What drove him to this breaking point? Did anyone see the warning signs? And was this massacre truly about revenge, or something much darker? Willow Creek, Kentucky, was the kind of small town where everyone knew each other, and family meant everything. But for Martin Caldwell, family had always been a source of pain. From an early age, he felt unwanted, unloved, and overshadowed by his older brother, Thomas Caldwell. Their mother, Eleanor Caldwell, had always favored Thomas, the smart, ambitious son who could do no wrong. Martin? He was the disappointment. No matter what he did, it was never good enough. Growing up, Martin was a quiet, withdrawn child. While Thomas excelled in school, sports, and social life, Martin struggled with self-doubt and felt invisible. His father, Gerald Caldwell, had been a strict, no-nonsense man who expected discipline and success. Thomas fit that mold perfectly. Martin? He was seen as weak, too emotional, too sensitive, never living up to his father's expectations. And after Gerald Caldwell died in a factory accident, the divide between Martin and his family only grew deeper. His mother leaned on Thomas for strength, making Martin feel even more like an outsider in his own home. As the years went on, Martin's resentment festered. His anger wasn't just about being the lesser son. It was about Thomas taking everything from him. Thomas took over their father's business while Martin struggled with dead-end jobs. Thomas had his mother's admiration while Martin was treated like a failure. And worst of all, Thomas married Martin's former girlfriend, the only person Martin had ever loved. That was the moment something shifted in Martin. His jealousy turned into obsession. His bitterness turned into hatred. And soon, that hatred would boil over into something much darker. Something that would destroy the entire Caldwell family. By the time Martin Caldwell reached his 30s, it was clear his life was going nowhere. While his older brother, Thomas, had built a successful career, a family, and a respected reputation, Martin was still living at home with his mother, unemployed, and drinking his days away. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of his failure, and the rage inside him grew. Martin had never held a steady job. Whenever he found work, it was always temporary. Factory jobs, warehouse shifts, odd handyman work. But he could never keep anything for long. He wasn't motivated. He wasn't reliable. And worst of all, he knew it. His mother, Eleanor, had spent years reminding him of his failures. She would compare him to Thomas constantly. Why can't you be more like your brother? Thomas is working hard to support his family, and you're still sitting here doing nothing. You should be grateful I haven't thrown you out yet. Martin was drowning in resentment, but he never showed it. On the outside, he acted quiet and reserved. But inside, his hatred for Thomas, for his mother, and for everything they had stolen from him was reaching a breaking point. Martin spent most of his time drinking alone in his room, flipping through gun catalogs and reading about military tactics. He had developed an unsettling fascination with firearms. At the local shooting range, he spent hours perfecting his aim, practicing over and over, almost obsessively. He started asking shop owners about silencers, about high-capacity magazines, things that should have raised alarms. But in a small town like Willow Creek, no one thought much of it. And while his family laughed and celebrated holidays together, Martin sat in his dark room, whispering one thought over and over again. They don't deserve it. They don't deserve to be happy. They stole my life. And soon, he would take theirs. For years, Martin Caldwell had been simmering in his own hatred. But up until now, it had been contained. He fantasized about hurting his family. He imagined getting revenge. But he had never taken real action until one night in March 1975 when everything changed. The breaking point, his mother's final threat. It had started like any other evening. Martin was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking cheap whiskey, staring at the peeling wallpaper as his mother ranted at him again. "You're a grown man, Martin. I'm not going to take care of you forever. You either find a job or you're out." At first, Martin just stared at her, expressionless. But when Thomas walked in, smirking, something inside Martin snapped. "Mom, we both know he'll never get his life together," Thomas said, laughing. "You might as well start packing his bags for him." The room felt like it was closing in. Martin's hands clenched into fists under the table. His mother laughed along with Thomas. The same mother who had never defended him. The same brother who had taken everything from him. Martin stood up without a word and walked out of the house. But in his mind, something was already in motion. He wasn't going to be the failure anymore. That night, Martin drove to a nearby hunting supply store, purchasing extra ammunition for his .357 Magnum revolver and his .22 caliber rifle. He doubled his trips to the shooting range, staying until closing time, practicing relentlessly. He spent hours alone in his room, loading and unloading his weapons, memorizing every move. His drinking didn't slow down, but now, every sip was accompanied by thoughts of blood. Martin was ready. He knew exactly when he would strike. Easter Sunday, the day his entire family would be in one place. And this time, they would finally listen to him. Easter Sunday, April 6th, 1975. The Caldwell family home was filled with laughter and warmth, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated thoughts running through Martin's mind. By mid-morning, the house was alive with activity. Children ran through the halls, excited about their Easter baskets, while the adults prepared dinner in the kitchen. The smell of roast ham and fresh bread filled the air. It was a perfect family gathering. But for Martin, it was the last one they would ever have. As the afternoon passed, Martin barely spoke. He wandered from room to room, listening to the voices of the people he hated most. His mother, Eleanor, gossiping with his sister-in-law in the kitchen. His nieces and nephews, laughing and playing on the living room floor. And then his brother Thomas, the man who had taken everything from him, sitting comfortably on the couch, surrounded by his perfect family. Martin's hands trembled, but not with fear. With anticipation. It was time. At 4 p.m., as the family gathered in the dining room, Martin quietly excused himself and walked to his bedroom. His weapons were already waiting. A .357 Magnum revolver. A .22 caliber rifle. Extra ammunition tucked neatly in his jacket pocket. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. And then, he stepped back into the dining room. The moment his mother saw him, her face changed. "Martin, what are you?" But before she could finish, he raised the revolver and fired the first shot. Straight into her chest. The room erupted into screams. Thomas lunged from his chair, but before he could reach Martin, another shot. Then another. And another. The children scrambled under the table, crying. His sister-in-law tried to shield her youngest son, but Martin was unstoppable. He moved methodically, shooting each family member one by one, ensuring that no one survived. The entire massacre lasted less than 5 minutes. In that short span of time, 11 lives were taken, and the house that had once been filled with warmth and laughter was now silent. But instead of running, Martin did something no one expected. He calmly set his gun down. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and sat at the table, surrounded by the bodies of his family. And for the next 3 hours, he sat there in complete silence, as if waiting for something, as if he needed to take it all in. Then, at 7 p.m., he finally stood up, picked up the phone, and dialed 911. "I need the police," he said calmly. "I've just killed my family." And then he waited. For the first time in his life, Martin Caldwell was in control. For 3 hours, Martin Caldwell sat alone in the silent house, surrounded by the bodies of his family. The blood had started to dry on the hardwood floor. The Easter dinner remained untouched, plates still neatly set on the dining table. A few candles flickered, their wax pooling at the base, the only movement in the room. Martin finished his third glass of whiskey, set it down carefully, and picked up the house phone. The 911 dispatcher's voice crackled through the receiver. 911, what's your emergency? Martin's voice was flat, eerily calm. "I need the police." I'll just kill my family. The line went silent for a moment. Sir, what did you just say? I killed them all? They're dead. Come get me. Then, he simply hung up the phone and waited. Minutes later, the first patrol officers pulled up to the Caldwell house. At first, they thought it had to be a hoax call. Willow Creek was a quiet town. Massacres didn't happen here. But as they stepped inside, reality hit them like a sledgehammer. Blood stained the walls and the floor. Bodies lay slumped over chairs, collapsed under the dining table, or sprawled across the room. The stench of gunpowder and death filled the air. And in the middle of it all, Martin sat calmly on the couch, waiting for them. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even blink. I told you, he said simply as officers placed him in handcuffs. The entire town would soon wake up to a nightmare they never could have imagined. By the next morning, news of the Caldwell family massacre had spread across Willow Creek. Neighbors gathered outside the police station, stunned and horrified. How could Martin, the quiet, awkward man they had known for years, do something so unthinkable? He was always a little odd, but this, one neighbor said, shaking her head. We never thought he was capable of something like this. But inside the interrogation room, Martin wasn't saying much at all. The gruesome details of the crime were about to come to light. And soon, so would his true motive. Martin Caldwell sat in the stark, windowless interrogation room of the Willow Creek Police Department. His wrists were cuffed to the table, but he didn't fidget. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't even look nervous. He just sat there, staring at the wall, completely emotionless. Detective Henry Lawson, a veteran officer who had seen his fair share of homicides, had never encountered anything like this. A man who had just slaughtered his entire family, sitting there as if he had done nothing more than pay a parking ticket. Martin, Lawson started flipping open the case file. I need you to help me understand what happened tonight. Martin blinked slowly. I already told you, he said. I killed them. His voice was flat, empty, as if he were describing someone else's crime. Why, Martin? Lawson pressed. Why would you do this to your own family? For the first time, Martin leaned forward slightly, his eyes dark and unreadable. Because they deserved it. Silence filled the room. Lawson exhaled sharply. They deserved it, he repeated. Martin nodded. My whole life they laughed at me, treated me like nothing. My mother, my brother, his wife, all of them. They looked at me like I was a failure, like I didn't matter. His jaw clenched. But now they know. A cold chill ran down Lawson's spine. So you plan this? He asked. Martin didn't even hesitate. Yes. As Martin's confession unfolded, another motive emerged, one that prosecutors would later argue in court. Martin had been financially dependent on his mother for years. With her gone, and with his brother and sister-in-law out of the way, he could claim a significant inheritance. He thought he could finally be in control. But there was one problem. Lawson closed the case file and leaned back in his chair. You know you won't be getting a dime, right? Martin's lips twitched, just slightly. Was it a smirk? A sign of regret? Or something else? No one would ever know. Because from that moment on, Martin stopped speaking altogether. No more confessions. No more explanations. Just silence. Within hours, the news exploded across Willow Creek. People wanted answers. But what terrified them most wasn't just the brutality of the crime. It was the fact that Martin Caldwell showed no emotion at all. And soon, his fate would be left in the hands of a jury. November 3rd, 1975. The People versus Martin Caldwell. The trial of Martin Caldwell was unlike anything the small town of Willow Creek, Kentucky had ever seen. For months, newspapers had called it the Easter Massacre, a crime so brutal and senseless that it left the community shaken to its core. Now, inside the packed courtroom, Martin sat expressionless, staring ahead as the proceedings began. No remorse, no reaction, not even when the prosecution played his chilling 911 call. I need the police. I'll just kill my family. The jury listened in silent horror. But Martin? He barely blinked. District Attorney William Prescott wasted no time establishing Martin's motive and premeditation. His voice was steady, confident, and unforgiving. This was not an act of insanity. This was an act of vengeance. The prosecution laid out the cold, calculated steps Martin took in the months leading up to the massacre. Gun purchases. Martin had been collecting firearms for over a year. Shooting practice. He doubled his time at the firing range, perfecting his aim before the attack. Planning the moment. He waited for Easter Sunday, knowing the entire family would be in one place. And then, the most damning evidence of all. He told detectives, in his own words, why he did it. The courtroom sat in horrified silence as Martin's taped confession played over the speakers. They deserved it. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. A juror shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Martin remained motionless, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Prescott continued, his voice unwavering. "This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't black out. He didn't lose control. He carried out these murders with precision. And for that, we must ensure that he never walks free again." Martin's lawyers, however, painted a different picture. They didn't deny that he committed the murders. Instead, they argued that Martin Caldwell was not in control of his actions. For years, Martin suffered in silence, defense attorney Joseph Langford began. He was abused, humiliated, and psychologically destroyed by his own family. He called 2 psychiatrists to the stand, both of whom testified that Martin exhibited signs of severe mental illness. Schizophrenia, paranoia, borderline personality disorder. He was a man suffering from untreated psychosis, Langford continued. Years of emotional abuse, isolation, and paranoia led to a complete mental collapse. The defense tried to humanize Martin, claiming that he was a broken man, pushed past his psychological breaking point. They argued for life in a mental institution, not prison. But the prosecution was ready. They fired back, reminding the jury, why would an insane man plan this attack so meticulously? Why did he calmly sit with the bodies for 3 hours before calling 911? Why was he clear-headed enough to immediately surrender? "This is not the mind of a delusional man," Prescott snapped. "This is the mind of a cold-blooded killer." For weeks, the jury listened to graphic crime scene photos, forensic evidence, and expert testimonies. The tension was unbearable. Some jurors leaned toward the insanity plea, believing that no rational person could have committed such an atrocity. Others saw Martin for what he was, a resentful, bitter man who had planned this massacre for years. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Then, on December 1st, 1975, the verdict was announced. But it wasn't what anyone expected. The jury was deadlocked. A mistrial was declared. The courtroom erupted in shock. For now, Martin had avoided a conviction. But the state wasn't finished. The prosecution immediately announced their intent to retry the case. This time, they vowed that justice would be served. The first trial had ended in chaos. A deadlocked jury. A mistrial. For a brief moment, it seemed like Martin Caldwell might escape true justice. But the state of Kentucky wasn't about to let that happen. Within weeks of the mistrial, prosecutors immediately pushed for a retrial, determined to prove, beyond any doubt, that Martin Caldwell was a cold-blooded killer, not an insane man who lost control. January 1976, the second trial begins. This time, the prosecution wasn't taking any chances. They knew what worked. They knew what needed to be hammered home for the jury. And they went for the kill. The prosecution team doubled down on forensic evidence, making sure the jury understood that. He bought his weapons months in advance, increasing his shooting practice. He waited for Easter Sunday, the perfect moment to kill as many family members as possible. But this time, they brought one more piece of damning evidence, a handwritten note found in Martin's bedroom. It wasn't a suicide note. It wasn't an apology. It was a list, a calculated, cold, handwritten list of who he planned to shoot first. At the top of the page, his mother's name, followed by his brother Thomas. And one by one, every victim's name was on that list. It was premeditation in its purest form, and it destroyed any remaining hope for an insanity defense. Once again, Martin's attorneys fought to convince the jury that he was mentally unstable. But the prosecution's relentless attack left them with little ground to stand on. The jury wasn't buying it this time. They saw Martin for what he truly was, not a man suffering from psychosis, but a bitter, calculated murderer who knew exactly what he was doing. And this time, the jury wasted no time. On February 10th, 1976, after just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their final decision. The judge asked Martin to rise. He stood, hands shackled, eyes as cold and lifeless as ever. Martin Caldwell, you have been found guilty on 11 counts of first-degree murder. You are hereby sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in gasps. For the first time in Kentucky history, a man had been given a sentence so severe. But Martin? He didn't react. Not a single emotion crossed his face. No tears, no anger, no relief. He just nodded and sat back down, as if he had expected this all along. Martin Caldwell was transferred to Kentucky State Penitentiary, where he would spend the rest of his days in total isolation. He never spoke about the murders again, never gave a real reason, never expressed regret. And in 2008, at the age of 88, Martin Caldwell died behind bars, taking his secrets with him to the grave. Even decades later, the Caldwell family massacre remains one of the deadliest familicides in U.S. history. The once peaceful town of Willow Creek, Kentucky, would never be the same again. The house where the murders took place sat abandoned for years, until it was finally torn down. Neighbors who had known the Caldwell family for generations still refused to speak about what happened that Easter Sunday in 1975. But even as the years passed, one question remained unanswered. Why? Could this have been prevented? Some experts believe Martin showed clear warning signs long before the massacre. His obsession with guns, his withdrawn, antisocial behavior, his deep-seated resentment and paranoia. Could someone have stopped him before it was too late? Or was Martin Caldwell always destined to explode? His case sparked debates about mental health, the limitations of the insanity defense, and how society deals with unstable, violent individuals before they reach their breaking point. Even today, criminologists continue to study Martin Caldwell, trying to understand how a quiet, unassuming man could transform into a cold-blooded killer overnight. Final thoughts. Did Martin get the justice he deserved? With 11 consecutive life sentences, Martin Caldwell never saw the outside world again. But some argue that his death in prison wasn't enough. Should he have faced the death penalty? Did he deserve a chance at mental health treatment instead? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, how many other men like Martin Caldwell are walking among us right now, quietly plotting, waiting, preparing? Could something like this happen again? And if so, would we recognize the warning signs before it was too late? Let's discuss in the comments. Was Martin Caldwell truly insane, or was he just a bitter, vengeful killer? Could his family have prevented this tragedy? Do you believe some people are simply born evil? Tell us your thoughts below. Help keep these stories alive. Subscribe to the True Crime Family. Insert link. Turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Like and share this video to spread awareness. Comment below with your thoughts. Because justice isn't just about solving crimes. It's about making sure they never happen again.